I want to thank Karen Tanasaka, who is our member relations manager at Women's League, who will be helping us with all of our audio this evening and our Zoom. She has put everybody into mute mode, and we will be having a question and answer period, so you can direct your questions to that. It is 8:01, so we are definitely starting. I'm Rabbi Ellen Wolintz-Fields. I'm the Executive Director of Women's League for Conservative Judaism. It's wonderful to see all of my sisters and special guests this evening with us. You'll find out who our guests are shortly. We're so grateful to be able to be here together this evening. And I want to thank our speakers who agreed to speak this evening about an issue that's very important to each and every one of us: racial injustice in our times. Erev Rosh Hashanah, we lost a great leader of our times, the Honorable Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of blessed memory, who I think taught all of us two important values that she lived by, ruled by, and that we should all use to guide our lives, and I believe can guide our discussion this evening as well. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice, you shall pursue. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha was the other verse. Love your neighbor as yourself. I actually have both verses on a mask. Before I introduce our speakers this evening, actually before Marlene will, I want to share a prayer written by our rabbi and mentor, Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, entitled Building the Beloved Community, a Prayer. Holy One, we quiver when we consider how long you've taught us to love each other, to have one law that governs us all, one standard of right and wrong by which we are each measured. How long you have taught us, God, that we are to be brothers and sisters to each other, to nurture each other, to defend each other, to protect each other. And how long we have, whenever we attain any degree of authority, used our fragile hold on power to try and make ourselves great by keeping others down. And we grieve at how much sorrow we have brought to you, God. We can imagine the pain of a parent who sees children quarreling, bullying, abusing. We know what that must do to your heart, God. So we pray that you, God, give us those promised new hearts quickly and in our time, for your sake and for ours. We pray that you remind us, as it says in your Torah, Lo tuchal lehitalem, you shall not be indifferent. We shall not be indifferent when we hear the cries of our brothers and sisters, whether they look like us or not. We shall not be indifferent when we cling to the privilege of our lives, yet passively watch others having their comfort stripped from them, and we do nothing. We shall not be indifferent when suffering people say, hear our cry, help us to unstop our ears and to allow our hearts to break wide open and finally to listen. The prophet Isaiah speaks about those people who have ears but do not hear, eyes but do not see. Don't let us be those people. Open our eyes so that we truly see. Open our ears so that we can truly hear. And let us rest in your love, that we are able to stand rooted and tall and do what battered humanity your children require. God bless the hands of all who are giving their strength to the work of justice, whether new to the effort or long practiced. Let us resolve to birth a new America, a new North America, one that retains the very best of its aspiration of equal justice for all, but one that now extends that vision to all of its children equally and without discrimination, so all of us can sit at your table and shape redemption together. And let us all say, Amen. I'd now like to call upon Marlene Oslick.
Shalom. I'm Marlene Oslick. I'm a past president of what was then Central New Jersey branch and is now the Garden State region. I have been active on the Resolutions Committee, World Affairs Committee since the 70s. That was 1970s, not 1870s. And I have recently, the last 3 years, been chairman of the committee. We have been studying various resolutions, and one that's coming up that we're studying is on police brutality and racial injustice. Tonight's program. This evening we have with us David Bernstein, Melanie Gorelick, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, and Yolanda Savage-Narva, and our Women's League for Conservative Judaism Sisters. David Bernstein is the president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, known as the JCPA. And Melanie Gorelick is senior vice president of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Jewish Council for Public Affairs is the national hub of the Community Relations Network, representing 125 local Jewish community relations councils and its 16 national Jewish agencies. Women's League is one of those 16. JCPA convenes, coordinates, builds consensus, and mobilizes our network on key issues while serving as the national representative of the network's public policy and public affairs platform. Together, the JCPA and their network advocate for a just and pluralistic American society, Israel's quest for peace and security, and human rights around the world in common cause with other civic, racial, ethnic, and faith-based leaders. The motto of JCPA is to educate, advocate, and mobilize. Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein is the rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor of the Jewish Federations of North America. He is best known for his essay, Color Erases, Color Paints, which was in the 2015 Tablet magazine. And that generates extensive conversation within the Jewish community about race and diversity. Growing up in a multiracial Chabad family in Monsey, New York, Rabbi Rothstein sees himself as a human bridge connecting disparate parts of the Jewish community. Yolanda Savage-Narva has 20 years experience working with public agencies and nonprofit organizations to promote equitable access to public health, elder care, and pedestrian safety. She is a Centers for Disease Control, CDC, trained public health specialist who has led community-based efforts and community health assessments for Indian Health Service, public education for the Alzheimer's Association, pedestrian safety, and advocacy for America Walks, and health equity for the National Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. Yolanda currently holds the position of Executive Director with Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting understanding, cooperation, and respect while fighting to eradicate racism and anti-Semitism and all forms of discrimination. She is also a member of the Jew v. Nation cohort, a fellowship sponsored by the Union for Reform Judaism, a 2019 Commission on Social Action, a co-chair of the Racial Justice Equity Committee for the RAC, a fellow of the Federation of Greater Washington, a member of Temple Micah in Washington, D.C., and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, an international Black sorority dedicated to community service and education.
Good evening, I'm Karen Cuker. I'm the co-chair of the Resolutions Committee, along with Marlene, and I bring you greetings this evening from the Mid-Atlantic region. Our program this evening, which is being recorded and will later be posted on the members only part of the Women's League website, is brought to us as a result of work being done in the Women's League World Affairs Committee, Social Justice Committee, and Resolutions Committee. Ultimately, the Women's League Resolutions Committee will be crafting a resolution to take a firm stand on racial injustice. But the goal this evening is to educate our women as the Resolution Committee addresses the issue of race in North America. We hope our time together will educate all of you about this topic and try to clarify some of the misconceptions that are often perpetuated. Thank you for joining us. Our triennial convention this year, which became virtual, was called Sisters Journeying. I had dental work done today. Sisters Journeying Together. This evening, we will hear from our speakers about their journey with racial injustice. And remember, you each bring your own personal voice and journey to this important issue in our time. I would like to ask each of our speakers this evening to tell us about their personal journey with racial injustice and what we can place in our educational, spiritual, and mental backpacks as we take a journey with racial injustice, and what misconceptions should we leave out of our backpacks. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. Yolanda Savage-Narva will begin, then Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, then Melanie Gorelick, and then David Bernstein. We will then follow up with questions, so please write your questions in the chat, and Dana Sirkin will moderate the chat and present your questions after our four speakers make their opening remarks. So now I believe we're inviting Yolanda Savage-Narva to begin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this special evening. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to a great dialogue at the end of our time speaking. So I usually start any meeting or presentation that I do honoring the land that we're on. And when we think about our country, when we think about North America, long before any of us were inhabiting this land, the indigenous population was here. And so for me in Washington, D.C., there are two tribes, the Piscataway tribe and the Anacostan tribe, who inhabited this land. And so I would like to invite you to just take a few moments to think about the indigenous population that inhabited the land before we were all here. And I do that by asking us to have a moment of silence. Thank you so much. When I was asked to speak on the panel, I thought a lot about what my journey has been as a woman who identifies as Black, as a woman who's also a Jew of color. And I couldn't help but stop and think about the need to frame this very moment that we're in. And looking back to when our world radically changed, when the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, and I think the date was March 9th, 2020. And then thinking about that time period up until today, and how radically things have changed in our world, starting from the pandemic, moving through to the racial injustice and the police brutality, that we've all witnessed as a part of the fabric of this country. Looking at some things that have also happened that have been positive. There's been a lot of things happening in the Supreme Court that has been positive for the LGBT community. This year is the 30th anniversary of the American with Disabilities Act. You know, shifting back to some other bigger things that are more tragic, we've lost several of our civil rights icons, the Congressman John Lewis, and if you're familiar with Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was also a big part of the civil rights movement. And then on Erev Rosh Hashanah, we lost Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I've just been thinking about my life in the context of the framework that we're living in today, and how I navigate that as a Black woman who's also Jewish. And it makes me really think about this unique period in time and the role of what we call intersectionality, the role of having multiple identities play a role in how we experience what happens in the United States, and how we actually interpret what that experience is to others. So if I step back a little bit, I was actually born in Chicago, Illinois, but I was raised in Mississippi. And you probably can hear my accent as I go through and say certain things. But I was born in one of the most racist places in this country. And while I didn't grow up I wasn't alive during the civil rights era, my mother was, and she has a very vivid memory of what it was like to live in a system that really at every turn was oppressive to people who looked like her. And so I take that seed of history with me as I navigate this journey of racial equity and justice. One of the things that I think is really important to share is that this is constantly my story. I don't have the opportunity to say, okay, today I am not going to be Black. I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to go into the world as someone different today. Every piece of every fabric of my daily existence is connected, unfortunately, to the racist hierarchy that this country has built, and the doubling down of wanting to make sure that hierarchy stays in place. And so even as someone who identifies as Jewish as well, what is a constant for me, no matter where I go, is that my skin color is brown. I'm a Black woman in America. I think one of the things that has struck me more recently, is the impact of the systemic structural racism that we're dealing with. The individual racism that I've experienced, and I've experienced this growing up in Mississippi. I've experienced racism from the Jewish community as a Jewish color. It is the oppressive systemic piece that I think transforms everything that we do. It's in our healthcare system, it's in our transportation system, our criminal justice system, our education system, our housing system, our economic system. And so every piece of the way the United States has been formed has been designed 400 years ago to justify a need to have people who are at a superior level and people who are at an inferior level. And then there are all these kind of spaces in between that other groups fill. But by and large, Black people in America, specifically people who are descendants of slaves who have grown up in this country, are at the the extreme bottom, and people who are white are at the top of that. And so that's the reality that I function in as a Black woman who is really trying to figure out from a personal standpoint how I navigate this world and try to fight for equal rights and justice. And then as a professional who is also focused on eliminating racism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. So what can we do to start addressing some of these things as a community? So from the educational piece, I think it's imperative to do all we can to learn and read and have conversations and ask questions about the things that we don't understand. Second, I think, is being in proximity with people who are different from who you are. And so when I say that, what does that mean? It means really thinking about how do I build relationships with Black and brown people. The language that we use is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC people, to really have an understanding of what it's like to be in their shoes in a country that's been designed to keep Black and brown people in a certain place, in a certain caste, so to speak. There's a feminist poet named Pat Parker who wrote quite a few very provocative poems. There's a piece that I like to quote that's really powerful in my opinion. And so one of the things that she says is, the first thing I want you to do is forget that I'm Black. And then the very second thing that I want you to do is never forget that I'm Black. And so you hear that and you say, Pat, what are you talking about? And so what it means is that I don't want to be judged and I don't want to be discriminated against because of the color of my skin. But I also want to make sure that you see me in my full humanity and my full beauty and what I bring to the rainbow of humanity. And so I think that either or is really something to think about when we're thinking about what we can do to actually fight racial injustices and inequities. And I think for us as Jews, there's a spiritual connection to fighting racial injustice and wanting to make sure that we have equitable communities. And I would say, number one, really tapping into our morals and values as Jews. There's a quote from the Talmud that I like to use that I think is very, very strong and grabs me, and I hope it grabs you as well. And it says this: in the Talmud, we learn that all people are descended from a single person, so that no person can say that my ancestor is greater than yours. In the Midrash and Yalkut Shimoni, we read that God created humanity from the four corners of the earth: yellow clay and white sand, black loam and red soil. Therefore, the earth can declare to no part of humanity that it does not belong here, that this soil is not their rightful home. And every time I read that, I really think about how important it is for us to understand that we are all part of the human connection. And when we think about fighting racial injustice and inequity from that lens, then we understand how important it is for us to be connected as a community when we do this. And quickly, because I know we have three other panelists and we want to hear from them. There's this mental backpack, right? You know, we talk about unpacking the invisible knapsack. You know, that's something that people have talked about with respect to power and privilege. But now we're thinking about our mental backpack. What do we need to strap on our backs and take with us during this journey that we're on? And I would say, number one, be prepared to get uncomfortable. This is not easy stuff. This is hard. There are going to be times when we're going to make missteps, but we have to be able to acknowledge that and say, hey, you know what? I messed up. I'm learning, and be uncomfortable, and knowing that there are going to be times where you're going to mess up. Understanding that this is not a sprint. It's not a marathon even. It's a lifelong journey. I think be prepared to learn as you go. That we're not gonna learn everything overnight, and understanding that this is something that we have to tackle from two different angles. One is holding the mirror up and saying, what is my role in contributing to this? And then number two, kind of looking out of the window, what can I do collectively with my community to make sure that I'm impacting racial justice and equity? And so the misconceptions that we have to leave behind in order to do this work. I call this the Oppression Olympics. And I think it's really important that when we're doing this work, that we bring our shared experiences to the conversation and to the work we're doing, but we don't let it get in the way of the work that we're doing. A second misconception is that racism is over, that there's, if there's not this kind of overt racism, the covert piece is I guess a stronger indication that we have so much more work to do. Third is that there is real historic trauma in people of color, and that's being passed down from generation to generation. That has not gone away. That's a real barrier for people of color. And lastly, I think that we have to recognize that we all play a role in this. And if we check off a box and we're doing something externally, that doesn't mean we turn away from what we have to do internally to make sure that we're doing all that we can to fight against racism and racial injustices in this country.
Thank you. And Rabbi Rothstein.
Shalom, friends. Hi, so good to be here with all of you, hopefully in person, and I hope that the time we spent together today only gives us more strength to engage in this work, and also to pray for the healing of those in need of healing in our generation. I just want to thank Women's League and my colleagues over at JCPA for this invitation to be here with you today. It really is my honor. All the more so fitting, these days, as Rabbi Ellen, as you mentioned, these days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur being Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, these 10 days of Teshuvah. Sometimes people translate as repentance, but Teshuvah also really having the word Shuvah, meaning to return. And actually this weekend, this Shabbat is called Shabbat Shuvah. And I'll tell you another way I look at this word, and that's why I also think it is fitting that we're coming together specifically in these days, is tshuva also meaning reconciliation. It's recognizing results and looking for strategies and ways to approach ourselves and the world around us with love. And the rabbis say there are two different kinds of teshuva. There's a teshuva ma'ahava, a teshuva that you want to engage in because of the love you have for humanity. And there's a teshuva miyira, a teshuva, a way of returning or repenting in ways because we're so concerned about what would happen if we don't correct our experiences. And I think today, this week, this month, this year, this generation, I think there's a tension between both, but hopefully at least we should be going in the right direction. And so, this high holiday season, I just want to share a little bit for you how I'm feeling. The way I prepped high holidays this year is I went down to Alabama. Growing up in a mixed race family in Muncie, New York, I was raised I was raised Haredi. I had sidelocks until I was 10 years old. I got kicked out of my school for going to NCSY programs, like co-ed programming, which was like not okay for where I was in school. And you know, throughout my life, I'll share a little bit some of the stories of my own experiences, but I'll tell you my preparation for Rosh Hashanah this year was going down to Birmingham and to Sawyerville. Sawyerville is where my family, on my mother's father's side, it was our ancestral land where we were enslaved. My ancestors, Charles Magruder, the Magruder family, our owners, had many plantations in the South. And Charles Magruder was a stud. He was a breeder. He actually had hundreds of children. Rachel Hill, my Mama Rachel, my great grandmother. She's my ancestor who was born enslaved, and she died a free woman. And this is a book of Job that she gave to her granddaughter, who's my great grandmother. And for those who are familiar with the book of Job, we know it's a book in the Hebrew canon in the Bible that is described as a book of suffering. It's a book of struggle, right? And even a time of teshuvah. For me, prepping for Rosh Hashanah, reminding ourselves, Yolanda, what you said so beautifully about reminding ourselves about our humanity. For me, I went down for those days to really meet with my family, to go to the soil, to the land of my ancestors. This week's Parsha, last thought, just that I'll share before I go into some of my own upbringing. It speaks to this idea of listening. Hazinu hashamayim va'adabera v'tishma aretz imrei fi, that we should listen and that the world actually witnesses who we are. Yarov kamatar lechi, the Torah reading continues by bringing analogies from nature, that nature watches the world around us. So our generation is really calling to all of us and our ancestors in every generation. And one of the other lines of this week's Torah portion is this idea of remembering the days that have come before. This idea, Zechor Yemot Olam Binu Shnor Dor Vador, that we remember that engaging in this work, it's not a moment, it's actually a movement, right? As they say, it's a threading in our history. And exploring our backgrounds, each of us as individuals, understanding our own context is so much a part of this work for social equity, racial justice in America. So a little bit more about me. I mentioned to you that I grew up in a mixed race family. For those of you who can see the color of my skin, might notice that I pass for white. And you know what I'll say is when I was be with my mother versus being with my father, I had very different experiences as a youth. I'll just share with you a picture of my parents and me over here. I hope you can see it as it comes in. And you know, sometimes people would say to me, "Oh, is that your nanny?" Or, "Oh, are you adopted?" Or, "Oh, you know," people were like, "I heard of like Black Jews. They're all from Ethiopia, right? Are you Ethiopian? Is your mom Ethiopian?" You know, people would say these kind of things to me that I wish I had never heard, because I'm the undercover brother, or I sometimes would joke as the white sheep of my family, one of the lightest skin of my siblings. I would sometimes have a front row seat to racial slurs, and I noticed in my upbringing just how each of us were treated differently. You know, we would joke that I'm the lightest of my three brothers, of me and my two older brothers. So I'm the vanilla, my other brother's mocha, my other brother's chocolate. And yes, it's like sometimes to cope, but people would be like, "Wait, you're brothers? How could you be brothers? Like, wait, you're show that we have the same last name and address." This was somewhat normal for my life. Yolanda was mentioning again, how this is not about one moment in time. This is about a historic frame of my family and one part of my family. So, you know, my father, I'll just share, was raised in a Jewish conservative household, and he became more religious when he met my mother. My mother was raised Methodist, and my father told my mother that she didn't have to convert. And my mother said that she had a Jewish neshama, and it was something that it wasn't even a question really for her. My grandfather did say that Judaism is a white man's religion, Now he doesn't know that my grandfather didn't know, his memory should be for a blessing. He didn't know that Jews are in over 70 countries around the world and that we're a global multiracial people. He saw maybe a dominant Eastern and Western European version of Judaism. But needless to say, my mother, from before she met my father, she talks about being in college, and she went to a Judaica store to buy a mezuzah, and she went in with her afro and how she looked, and the person behind the counter said, "A mezuzah? Like you want a mezuzah?" And like kind of questioning her, and she said, "Yes, a mezuzah." And she took out money, and then the person gave her a mezuzah, and it was like almost like this weird exchange for her. Another thing I'll say, my mother is biracial, so I'm multiracial. And as we think of these terms, the term Jew of color, my parents have been married for 40 years. We weren't using this term Jew of color. It's definitely, again, to Yolanda's point, helpful and on one level to have a term for visibility, to understand that we are here, we are real, and that we are part of the community. But then also, it's a little reductive. Not everybody identifies with that term. It's not actually descriptive of the difference between the Black experience in America and the Asian or the Latinx experience. And those are actually important frames. But needless to say, it's an important lens. My mother's mother, their family they fought in the American Revolutionary War and the Civil War. So this is actually a journal from my ancestor, George Gibbs, and Nicholas Gibbs. There's a historical society. He's one of the founders. I'm a part of the society Sons of the American Revolution. I don't know how many Orthodox rabbis from Muncie, New York, who are mixed race, are in the Sons of the American Revolution. If you know any others, please put them in touch with me. But I'll just note for you that yes, my father's side of the family fled Russian pogroms at the turn of the 20th century and joined many in fleeing persecution and anti-Semitism, longing for freedom, right? What Emma Lazarus is on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your hungry, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, right? She was talking about the persecution of Jews all over Europe at those times, and also in the Ukraine and Russia. And so what's interesting also, though, is that just 50 years earlier in Mississippi, fighting for the Confederacy, my ancestor was fighting for a different kind of freedom, a freedom of economics, let's say, from what they thought made sense. Last week, I went to Sawyerville, Alabama, where my ancestors were enslaved in America, longing for freedom, while I also had an ancestor fighting for a different kind of freedom. And I would just say that for so many of us, I think our ancestors could have never imagined us. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams, as they say. But in another way, this generation of having so much paradox and holding so much tension around what is a way forward, I think is a part of what the American love story is all about. That we do have many different voices in who we are. And I'm made in America, like as a Jew, as an Orthodox Jew from Muncie, New York, who has the honor of serving the Jewish Federation system, working for Jewish Federations of North America. Today, I do feel like this idea of legacy and this idea of us being reminded that, if you're a Hamilton fan, the musical, Lynn says, "America, you great unfinished symphony, you sent for me," right? Being sent by our ancestors, this idea that we have a legacy to uphold is something that I hope that we all can relate to. Just a few more comments. In a way, we know, I think everyone's on the same page, that race does not exist. It's ridiculous. It's like an idea that unfortunately has accelerated such a perversion of what humanity represents. And we know that using race was something that allowed and enabled Hitler to accomplish his tasks when it came to the Holocaust. And we know it was also something that was used to accomplish economic growth and accelerated growth by calling humans chattel, putting a value. So I just want to point out that although it is in very much a false idea, we know that it has real consequences. And I would just say that so much of the work that I'm engaged with, and with this I'll come in for a landing for now, I feel rooted in this idea of recognizing that there are consequences in society today for how we are all treated. And my entire life, what my parents taught me, this idea of redemption, this idea of Mashiach, this idea of world peace, or the American promise, or the American dream, whatever words you want to use for this, it's not coming until we build a world from love. This is what I believe, and one that really does work for everyone, where no one is left out because of the color of their skin, because of what they believe in. And it's something that I believe what we're trying to bring in the world today. So as I share my background with you, I hope we could connect more. I hope we can learn from each other. And just so much of what I think we really need to be considering today is that none of this is happening in isolation. This is about our generation as a whole, right? The demographers in the US Census Bureau point out that by 2044, America will be, for the first time in history, a majority non-white society, right? The value of racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity is what is a part of our generation like never before, and it's only continuing to be an important value. So as we come together, I think recognizing that our learning, the exposure that we have to these issues is essential, that it's ongoing work. It's essential that we have this opportunity for us to be able to learn together the way we are doing today. And I really am grateful, again, to be invited to speak with you today. And I also say that growing up, there weren't conversations like this. My family, we did not have an address. Today, what a beautiful thing that we're engaging in these the holy work of making sure that we're all supported and like validated for who we are. Like it is, you know, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, right? The final war, right? The war of Mashiach, a spiritual and holy war, will be based on color, race. It's rooted in our identities, our cultural backgrounds. So the more we tap into this, friends, I think we're truly on our way. Shana Tova, thank you for allowing me to share.
Shana Tova, Isaiah, and Yolanda, thank you both for being so open and sharing so much tonight. And thank you to the Conservative League for even addressing this issue and considering a resolution on these topics. It's very, very important. My name is Melanie Gorelick, and I grew up in Manhattan in New York during the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. So I have been a soldier almost with a straight path up until my 50s, working on social justice issues and civil and human rights. When I was in my younger years, I worked really on women's issues, and I worked at the United Nations for many years. So I had experience of multicultural kind of negotiation, openness, and the understanding that for women to achieve empowerment, we have to really hear each other, be open, and work for change together. And I've been working in the community relations field for the past 16 years. I've been with the Jewish Council for Public Affairs for 4 years. And one thing that I've noticed is that the Jewish community has had so much pride growing up, like many of you probably had so much pride in the Black-Jewish relationships and the role we played during the civil rights movement for Dr. Prince, Rabbi Prince, excuse me, and all the really good people and history that we're so proud of. But once we got into about 5 or 6 years ago, we realized that the relationships were changing, that people who had marched together in DC and down south were passing away, were moving on, and that the younger people and younger emerging leaders didn't know each other, were not proximate to each other, and didn't even understand the shared history and weren't creating shared history. And it became a real big priority for the Jewish Council for Public Affairs So about 5 years ago, we created a criminal justice reform initiative. And the aim of that initiative was to move the Jewish community back into being proximate with the Black community, working on today's civil rights crisis, civil rights priority issues. And we have been working to educate, advocate, and mobilize the Jewish community on this concern. For the past 5 years, people have been saying to us, why is JCPA working on these issues? Why criminal justice reform? This isn't a Jewish issue, and people weren't prioritizing these concerns. But we kept at it because we wanted to educate, we wanted to move the needle, and we really, really wanted to see the Jewish community build relationships with others in their community. One thing that we've seen over time is in the 1990s, the Jewish community felt very settled in America, and we saw a decrease in community relations work, a decrease in supporting staff and professionals who would be advocating and sitting at local community council tables, working on local issues like housing and employment, because instead we saw a big migration to the suburbs and to worrying more about Israel and issues really about Jewish identity and Jewish future. But what that has done for us is that we weren't paying attention and aware of what our neighbors were experiencing, which since the 1990s, 1 in 3 Black men have spent time in the prison system, in our justice system. And it really only took us to about 2015, many years, about 20 years later, to realize this experience was taking place. So, you know, during this period of COVID period of time, it became abundantly aware about racial disparities just on how the pandemic was impacting the Black community. And then on top of that, we had the George Floyd incident. And what JCPA decided to do was to really mobilize the Jewish community relations around, community relation councils around the country, and also to really activate our whole network to lean in, to listen, to be able to say Black Lives Matter. And this really has been quite a controversial statement. There is an assumption within the Jewish community of many that Black Lives Matter is a hierarchical organization that is anti-Israel, that's anti-Semitic, and there's fear about what it's really calling for. And so what we've been doing is a lot of education to explain that the hashtag Black Lives Matter is not one organization. It is the moment, a social movement to listen to the experiences of Black people in our country and to reimagine public safety for everyone and the country that we want to be, where there's equality and justice and where everyone has the opportunity. What we've had to do, though, is we really have had to do a lot of education. And one of the main points, because I know I don't have a lot of time right now, so I'm trying to get a lot in. One of the main points that I want to leave with you is that there's some misunderstanding about the Black Lives Movement. And there is different organizations. One is called the Movement for Black Lives. The Movement for Black Lives in 2015, I think it was established about 2013, but in 2015 and 16, it put out a platform, I believe, for the last presidential elections. And in that platform was a divestment piece that had some anti-Israel statement. It was very, very small. I'm not trying to be given excuses, but it was very small component of their charter. But yet for the Jewish community, this was just one push too far. And so the whole Black Lives Matter got, people started saying that Black Lives Matter was anti-Semitic. And JCPA at that time also did a lot of education to say, let's not let that deter us from all the other issues that our friends in our country our culture and our policies, the systematic racism that exists in our country, let's not let that stop us from working on these concerns. Now let's first fast forward to right now. The Black Lives Matter movement there is a charter. The charter right now doesn't say anything about Israel on it. There's nothing else that's anti-Semitic in it at all, period. Neither was there anything, last time was there anything that was anti-Semitic. And so we don't know necessarily that they're not going to extend the platform and add anything on Israel, but right now nothing exists. And so what we have really been encouraging Jews around the country to do is to, and this maybe can be for, if you were going to have your backpack of what you were going to leave here with, the first is to open our hearts and open our ears and just listen to other people's experiences. If you have Black friends, if you have Black colleagues, work with Black organizations, listen to other people's experiences, build relationships. What we found for a lot of people in our field is that they put out great statements, but they actually weren't working with other Black organizations. So we can have great policy and we can have great intention and we can have great values, but how are we activating and advocating with our feet? So open our hearts, open our ears, be open, partner together, do it without fear. Not everything has to be about anti-Semitism. We can let others speak about their experiences. And if we are concerned about anti-Semitism, it's easier to call it out when we're in relationship with each other or when we educate and understand where the other person's coming from. So what I want to leave you with, because I want to give David a few moments to speak, is I encourage you to partner together, become active, speak out, advocate, educate, and activate, and really help make a difference in this country and be part of the movement, because there is an intergenerational, intercultural movement taking place, and there will be change. Might not happen the next 4 years, but with the president, but actually I think that's going to just embolden the change more. And this is the moment for people to know Jewish values of justice and pluralism and fighting of hate, or it's a moment for people to believe that Jews really don't care. So this is our moment to really shape the country that we want to live in. David?
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Melanie. Thanks to my other fellow panelists. So I asked to give a brief experience that sort of shaped who I am today. When I was in 5th grade in 1977, I lived in Columbus, Ohio. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. And we were on the verge of busing for the first time, integrating our public school system. And I had a white teacher in a very white school, in a very white classroom, say that she was not going to teach those dirty Black kids who would be entering the school. And there was one Black girl who she did not care anything about who was in that classroom. And I just remember seeing her cower, and I felt that pain, and it really always stuck with me. Fast forward several years later, when I was now in an integrated high school, and I was experiencing a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of swastikas in my books, a lot of coins at my thrown at me, not from Black kids, by the way, but from mostly blue-collar white kids. And I think in my own mind, in my own consciousness, I began to see various forms of hatred and racism as being inextricably linked and affecting me, and that one couldn't be uprooted without uprooting the other, that we had to see racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry as connected to each other, and the only way to fight them was to fight them together. So I've been able to do that in my career. I've been very, very lucky to be part of organizations like the JCPA that saw anti-Semitism or racism as twin scourges that we had to face together. And I could work with Black leaders and Latino leaders and Asian American leaders to try to make America a better place for all people. I want to just for 1 second, talk about what Melanie talked about, which is the distinction between the distinctions within the Black Lives Matter movement. I have a friend who is a Black pastor who I've known for many years. I went to Israel with him for the first time in 1994, and have stayed in touch with him. He has been to Israel 4 times since then. He calls himself a Zionist, and he has a big Black Lives Matter sign on his front lawn. He is not a supporter of Black Lives Matter. He is Black Lives Matter. And if you call Black Lives Matter an anti-Semitic movement, you are calling him a friend of Israel, someone who loves the Jewish people, an anti-Semite. You are calling him an anti-Semite because he is Black Lives Matter just as much as maybe the radical activist that you've read about more in the paper has made statements that we don't like about Israel. But he's just as much Black Lives Matter as that activist. And that's why it's so important for us to make these distinctions, because if we don't, then we are actually hurting ourselves in the process, and we are slandering our friends, and we don't like to slander our friends. I know none of us want to slander our friends. There's another reason, and I told this to Alan that I would speak about, for us to make sure we're at this table. And I noticed that there was one comment in the chat about why some Jews feel unwelcome in these circles. And I want to say that it is true that there are going to be BDS activists in these circles, that you're going to find people who we strongly disagree with in these circles. We're going to find people who are on the opposite side of issues in these circles. But if you want to fight anti-Semitism and you want to fight BDS, then you will need to be at these tables. Because if you're not at the table, if we're not at the table, or you make it harder for groups like ours to be at the table because you're constantly saying, don't be at the table because there's going to be anti-Semites at the table, you will make it so that there will be radical voices, sometimes representing the Jewish community, who are at those tables and not us. And they will be influencing the movement and not us. Would you rather me and some of my colleagues who have been on this panel to be at those tables, or would you rather radicals? And so I'm imploring you to understand Jewish interests in a bigger way, in a more thoughtful way. Jewish interests are not to stay away from uncomfortable circles. It's the Jewish interest to lean in. It's the Jewish interest to be at these tables. It's the Jewish interest to dialogue with people around difference. And if we don't, and you make it impossible, or another group makes it impossible for us to do it, we will see an increase in anti-Semitism, not a decline in anti-Semitism. So I really want to thank you all for the opportunity to dialogue, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Hi, I'm Dana Sirkin, and I am asked to ask the questions. There's been a huge number of questions on the chat. Let's see, I wanted to go back to the very beginning with questions that were directed toward Yolanda. I found that often intersectionality works against Jews who support Israel. How does that affect you as a Black Jewish woman?
It's the elephant in the room, honestly. I am constantly asked to, almost to pick sides. What do you think about this issue? I'll give an example that happened in Washington, D.C. about 2.5 years ago. And this made national news when our councilman was driving to work one day. I think it was in March, and it was snowing. And he did a Facebook Live post about, wow, it's snowing in Washington, D.C. It must be the Rothschilds. And so he made, that's the statement that he made. And that just, turned into this crazy back and forth about, where this person got this information, and anti-Semitism in the Black community. And I was being constantly tasked with trying to explain and talk about, how this happens, and it's really challenging. And so where I fall with it, because I have to stop and say this is what we need to do. We need to understand that white nationalism is designed to divide and conquer, people of color, the Jewish community, and other marginalized communities, so we can fight with one another. So their system of white supremacy can take hold. And so I stop and ask people, we have a connection as human beings, and this is designed for us to be pit against each other. And we have to, recognize that, and we have to be smarter than that, and we have to be ready to fight for each other's issues, regardless of how people have kind of framed our narratives for us. And so, that's really where I fall. And there are a lot of challenges and issues and nuances, between the communities. But I have people understand that my intersectional identity is here to support both communities, and it's here to support humanity overall.
Thank you. Another question came from someone saying that our synagogue put up a sign that reads, "We believe that Black Lives Matter, and as a result, we've lost several families as members because they believe that Black Lives Matter is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. How can the JCPA reach out to the Jewish community to educate these people that it is not true?"
I'm happy to start. David, you could jump in. So JCPA has created a number of materials. We've put together fact sheets, and we've done about 25 or more webinars on the issue, from policing all the way through to criminal justice reform, hearing from different speakers on Black Lives Matter, from NAACP, Derek Johnson, the CEO, to Eric Ward. So there's a lot of information out there that can be shared with people. It is very important, though, that you can't go ahead of where people are. And what we learn really is that it's important, if you can't say Black Lives Matter, or you can't come out striding about Black Lives Matter, to still provide an opportunity for people who are Black to come speak about their experience to people. And that is really what moves people the most. So, to hear Yolanda's story, or to hear people's story, especially if you're in a community, and we tell people to start local. So if you have friends who are in the community, if you work, for us, JCRCs are professional organizations, but rabbis can do this too in their synagogues. Bring in other leaders who are Black in the community to speak. What are the major issues in your town council, or in your state, in your community, that is harming people of color? And so move the conversation not to the term Black Lives Matter and all that it brings up for people, but to the real human element of, this is how people are being harmed or impacted. These are the changes that can be made. These are the policies that you can advocate. These are the coalitions you can join to make a change. And you find that from that kind of methodology of building relationship and educating, people actually, and Jewish people, want to do something because it's in our kishkas, because that's part of Jewish values. So that's how we approach it, and we have putting guidelines and really working with JCRCs who are in communities where the Jewish community is what I think is fearful or has a lot of disinformation, to move this forward, and it's been working.
So I know we're short on time, or over time already. Wondering if we have permission to go a little bit farther to ask other questions, or is this a time to sum things up? Do I have an answer from someone up above me?
You can go on for a little while longer.
Okay. So there was a question that I wanted to ask. It came from Renee Reynolds. What exercises or interactions do you, I think it was directed toward Yolanda, do with Jewish and Black teens? Are there Black Jewish students involved? Also, this person was on the JCRC in Louisville, and tried to reach out to Black churches with little success initially. And as David Bernstein said, we have to lean in.
Yeah, we do have to lean in. Thanks for the question. So I do run a nonprofit that works with teens in Washington, D.C., who for the past 25 years have identified as Black and or Jewish. And so we're in our 26th year. And this year we have actually expanded that demographic to include students who identify not necessarily specifically as Black and or Jewish. And the conversations around that has been very rich and very enlightening for all of our students. But I think one of the things that we've been really focused on is making sure that we're teaching our kids how to address the inequities in our system through the lens of the historical and cultural experiences of Blacks and Jews. And so that's the foundational piece of the program that we run, in addition to having them understand the multiple, inequities that exist around classism, around homophobia, around ableism, and all of those pieces. And so the dialogue between these students is awesomely deep and introspective. So they're learning about themselves while they're learning about other groups as well. And then they're building bridges that they wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to build, because I think people really kind of stay in, in communities and groups where they feel comfortable and where they feel people are like them. And Operation Understanding DC has really done the opposite, taking the kids out of their comfort zones and really, pushing them to learn about each other, to question each other, to challenge each other. And hopefully taking these tools that they've learned while they're in this program and translating that into real equity and justice as they matriculate through college and throughout their lives. Okay. So, that's really what we've been focused on. And we have 700 alums in the field at this point, because the program has been around for 26 years.
That's wonderful. I'm going to signal one more question because I know it is getting late. Someone asked, what about the influence of Sirkin and people of his ilk and the damage that movement has done to the Black-Jewish relationships? I don't know if you want to take that.
If it's okay, I'll try,
David,
or I'll start. First of all, let me just say, by the way, Yolanda, Operation Understanding is a wonderful program, and I knew some of its early directors, and I'm so thankful that it continues to do the work that it does. So Louis Farrakhan. So look, this is always going to be a tough sticking point, I think, in the Black-Jewish relationship, and I don't think we should try to paper over it. For Jews, Farrakhan is an anti-Semite, a homophobe, and so forth, and I don't think we can or should back down from that. I mean, I think there's a strong moral imperative to say whenever you see anti-Semitism, we have to speak out against it. There are many Blacks who will fully acknowledge Louis Farrakhan's anti-Semitism, but still see him as an important leader in the struggle with the ability to help transform the lives of Black men in particular. And so we saw that during the Million Man March. And I think this is going to be a continual painful dialogue. And look, I think that we Jews have to be able to do two things at the same time. We have to be able to walk and chew gum, as they say. On the one hand, we have to fight for anti-Semitism wherever it comes from, including from the likes of Louis Farrakhan. And we shouldn't back down, and we should call him out. And we should call out people who support Louis Farrakhan. And on the other, understand that there are severe inequities in the society, and that we have a role to play in helping end those inequities. And even sometimes if there are tensions between those two objectives, we have to navigate them. We have to continue to try our best and to sort of navigate the tensions as they come to us. And still know that we have friends in the Black community, and we have Jews of color who are part of our struggle as well. and that we have work to do, and we can do both of those things, and we must do both of those things at the same time.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Debbie Goldich to close us out.
Thank you, Dana. And I want to thank our wonderful speakers tonight, Yolanda Savage-Narva, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, Melanie Gorelick, and David Bernstein. I think that this is a beginning conversation, and we appreciate that you came tonight to spend time with us to start the conversation. We know that this is not over. We know that this is something that as an organization, we want to continue the conversation. And so we will be in touch because we know that this was a great beginning. Again, we thank you so much for coming and being with us tonight. And I want to thank all 123 of our sisters who were here with us tonight, who also recognize and appreciate that this is an important topic and timely and something that we will continue the conversation. Good night, stay healthy, and stay safe.